Welcome, everybody. Thank you very much indeed for joining us with the Paddy Ashdown Foundation. What we're trying to do is look at some of the important issues that are facing this world. The Paddy Ashdown Forum has been trying very hard to help everybody understand and to try and extract them from this siloed thinking that we have. And indeed, most of the time our governments do have issues around trying to break down these silos, but whether or not we're recognizing them and understanding quickly enough that we've got to move in a completely different way to we've been planning and policy making and developing strategies over the last 10 years, because now it's beginning to be obvious that things are changing fast and we need to make sure we understand what's going on. I'm very excited to be able to say that, the Paddy Ashdown Forum is working on building a better future for businesses, for communities and for economies. We firmly believe that trade and building trade and making sure that communities have the benefit of some sort of globalization, bearing in mind that 60% of the world's population has been brought out of poverty due to trade. We don't want to see it going, but we see increasingly the cost of energy forcing the trade into a backward corner. In the UK, we have the most phenomenally high energy costs. These energy costs are very difficult to encourage people to set up trading in our country. It becomes more and more difficult to understand what's happening there. So as we go through, we'll talk about it in more detail, but our view is that we should be fueling the future, but we just don't know how to fuel it properly. This is why we've invited Stuart Broadley to come along. He's the CEO of the Energy Industries Council. He works worldwide. He's talking to us from Hamburg at the moment, just to emphasize that point. And he's going to just introduce what the EIC do. And then we'll start carrying on with some more details about how we can work further within this. So I'll hand over to you if that's okay.
Yes, thank you, Leslie. Hi, can you hear me okay, Leslie? Just checking.
We can hear you very well.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to join you today. Of course, the last time we spoke was when you kindly came to feature in one of our podcasts, the EIC Clearly podcast, which was all about trade, international trade, and why aren't more companies, focusing on trade as a growth strategy. And thank you so much, Leslie, for your insights, which our members lapped up. So, I'm Stuart Broadley, CEO of EIC. EIC is an 82-year-old energy trade association. We're energy agnostic, which means we support all energy sectors. We're the largest energy trade association in the UK and the fifth largest in the world. Our job is to help our members, of which we have about 1,000 members, and they're energy companies, they're not individuals. And they're in the UK, but actually we have about 500 members in the UK and 500 all over the world outside the UK. So we're not UK only, although that is our legacy. And our job is to help our members use smart data, so smart market intelligence, to understand the best market opportunities around the world and then pursue those opportunities and hopefully win that business around the world, to grow their market share, grow their influence around the world. So we're very much all about helping companies to do more trade, and that's how Leslie and I have been working together recently. So delighted to be here today. And some of the data that we have, I think will help answer maybe some of the questions you have today. So I'm happy to share some of the data. The other thing, just to say quickly, is that another thing we do is we advocate on behalf of the energy supply chain. So you get a lot of energy advocacy groups that are perhaps an oil and gas group or a nuclear group, or perhaps they're regional. So they're perhaps a sort of a Northeast cluster group. Well, we're a global advocacy group on behalf of the energy supply chain. So we're not saying oil and gas is bad, renewables are good. We're saying the supply chain needs help. Otherwise, they won't be able to support the energy transition. They won't be able to get international trade because they can't get the funding, because policies are not consistent, and so on. So perhaps we can talk about some of those things too.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to exploring some of those, because I believe that the world is always a better place if it trades with each other. We like to think that it prevents war, and it certainly has been very effective in doing so. So let's hope we can find some better solutions. I think one of the things that struck me when I reread the industrial strategy was actually it was taking us, the UK's industrial strategy has taken us a lot further forward into this integration that we really advocate for within the Paddy Ashdown Forum. It's been much clearer in that we can understand how it can work, but of course we've still got this niggling thing about how much energy costs the UK as opposed to all the other countries. Is there something we could talk around that for a moment? Because obviously they've put in some special policies, some special funds, but shouldn't we just be looking at how everybody gets helped with our energy costs?
Well, it's certainly true, unfortunately, that the UK's energy costs are the highest of any G20 nation, actually probably the highest of any state in the EU, maybe the world. I haven't actually really checked if it's the world, but it's certainly, unfortunately, very high. And for instance, we've had some data center announcements come into the UK recently where their only sort of comment that they made to the press, which is a sort of subject to getting your utility cost, your energy cost down. So it's definitely a major factor. And I think that obviously politically there's a view from the current Labour government that it's all about reducing our reliance on wholesale energy costs, which have been linked to the gas prices. And of course, that's all around when the Russian invasion of Ukraine happened and gas prices tripled. That laboured the Conservative government, as in burdened them with the costs of supporting an industry that couldn't afford it, consumers that couldn't afford it. The fact is now the gas prices are pretty low, and it wasn't just the UK that had to deal with that high gas price. The whole of Europe had to deal with that consequence, and it had a cascade effect around the world. So it's not just the UK. So I think the first thing to say is our energy prices, electricity prices generally are not really high just because of gas prices, but vulnerable to the high gas price when it spikes. So I think the issue is much more complex than that. And it'd be great to get any people's comments on that as we go through this discussion today. But as a starter for 10, there is, I think, some simple logic to say that the government has heavily subsidized a number of energy technologies to be developed in the UK in the last 15 years to pursue a net zero strategy. Now, EIC is a big fan of the work that the UK has done. That we're very proud of the fact that we're in the UK, and the UK was the first nation in the world to halve its emissions, back to the 1990 threshold, which it did last year. And there's a lot to be proud of. And the strategy around offshore wind was a success, definitely. We were the largest producer of offshore wind until 2 years ago when China overtook us. So there's a lot to be proud of, I think, in the UK. But unfortunately, these strategies do bring, complexities, and they bring costs because at the end of the day, they are heavily subsidised, and that has to be paid.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the thing that my research showed me that actually energy prices, not just gas, because obviously it's electricity and a lot of the time now as well. And indeed, we'd like it to be all sorts of different sources. It says currently 4 times higher than those in the USA. And 46% above the global average. And the question that worries me is, I know working with Make UK that the manufacturers actually, they may only represent around about 11 to 13% of the businesses, but actually represent 45% of our exports. And exports, we know, are good for our economy. And I suppose that, what we're seeing now is the USA trying to manage their exports and their imports in particular to make sure that things aren't, they've noticed that they've deindustrialized by accident. And, I wonder whether we're forcing people into other sectors and we're forgetting our manufacturing, which actually brings us good quality jobs. It brings us a lot more stability, and manufacturing countries tend to do much better than those who are relying solely on their service skills. And I suppose my question is, the cost of energy does impact on the efficacy of the strategy, but what can we do? What can we literally do to try and maintain these? Is there a way of working more collaboratively? Is it the fact that we're not actually, the carbonization is one thing, but actually we also have the other issue around how we make money and how we actually continue to grow our industrial sector?
Can I try and answer that then with some data? Because I think that a lot of time, if you read the press or you turn into the news, there's a lot of kind of hyperbole around these kind of topics.
Yeah.
Let's use some data to try and understand what's happening in terms of where's the money going in this energy sector. So, and this is some of the data that EIC has, actually uniquely has. And I'm going to start globally first. And then we can sort of bring it down as you, depending upon how you want to pursue this, Leslie, to a UK perspective or certain technologies. So we track $16 trillion worth of live energy projects that are somewhere in the development cycle around the world, of which about 2% of that is in the UK. This is across all energy sectors, oil and gas, renewables, some of the transition technologies like hydrogen and carbon capture, nuclear, of course, so kind of all sectors. What tends to happen, of course, is we believe what we read in the press. And I don't mean that in a cynical way. I mean that we read, oh, there's another offshore wind project. Oh, there's another hydrogen project. Oh, there's another, I don't know, sort of carbon capture project. And we don't often read about projects, let's say, like an oil and gas project, because they're few and far between in terms of announcements. So it's definitely true that 2/3 or more of all the quantity of projects that are in that 16,000 projects or $16 trillion worth of projects that are under development are what you call green. So whether they're mature renewables, of which some are extremely low cost and basically not subsidized. So a lot of the solar PV sector around the world now is regarded as very low cost, very commercialized, very accessible, very suitable for distributed as well as utility scale power. We have also onshore wind, which is seen as a low cost, basically non-subsidized or low subsidized technology. Fixed bed offshore wind needs some subsidy at the moment, unfortunately, but that's as much as anything else because of the permitting and the grid issues right now. The actual technology is low cost and pretty sustainable. But so if you look at that, you would say, well, those projects are happening all over the place and they're low cost. They must all be getting a lot of funding right now. And then you go to oil and gas at the other end and you'd say, well, that's oil and gas. I don't read about many projects in oil and gas, but all I do read about oil and gas is the government doesn't support it and activists don't like it and COP doesn't support it. And so that obviously isn't happening. So the truth is quite different, actually, because, yes, you read about all of these kind of trends of all the projects that should be happening versus aren't. So then you break it down into, okay, actually, if you convert those projects into the funds that are the value of those projects and those projects that are actually at what's called FID, so final investment decision, which means those projects have gone far enough through the development cycle that they've got full funding, they've got grid access if they need grid access, they've got permitting if they need permitting. All the funding is in place from whoever is backing it, and it's going to go ahead. So that means from our members' point of view, the supply chain's point of view, that's where we get excited. Because, oh, now our supply chain can actually do business, whether it's domestically or around the world, and that's when we help them. That becomes the kind of the real green light, the flag gets waved, away we go, everybody, and let's go and win some business. So we've always tracked this FID rate. Because it's the most important data for our members. But governments and other commentators don't seem to focus on that. They focus on the first data, which is, well, how many projects are getting announced? If it's announced, it must be real. And there's a huge difference between the two. And I guess, so oil and gas, in summary, is actually the sector which is most financeable around the world, most bankable around the world, whether you like it or not. So about 30 to 40% of all the oil and gas projects currently under development are already at FID. And those projects are typically very bespoke, high engineering content, very suitable for the British supply chain, actually, who has a very good capability in the UK and a 30, 40-year legacy capability built up as sort of invested exporters, international traders around the world with huge facilities around the world. It's a great match for the UK supply chain. So those technologies, although the UK government doesn't want to talk about, and actually they won't support it. There's still legislation that says no department of the UK government is allowed to support the oil and gas industry, with a couple of exceptions like decommissioning and a little bit of decarbonisation technology. This includes, by the way, embassies around the world. So if you're an ambassador in an oil nation, an oil-rich nation, you're not allowed to help a British company. You're not allowed to even meet with that oil-producing company to support your British company that's wanting to perhaps do that business. So that's a lot of what we have to do is then we step in. After oil and gas, the next technology, which is most funded, is large-scale nuclear. Because as of 3 years ago, nuclear's taxonomy was changed to mean that if it's a nuclear technology, it satisfies the requirements of COP to meet the country definitions for their net zero targets. So therefore, nuclear is now seen as meeting net zero legally binding targets. So a lot of countries have now stepped into nuclear. Okay, now you're waiting for me to say, okay, so how are we doing with the other technologies? And that's where the problem is. When you come to onshore wind, offshore wind, and solar, and even hydrogen carbon capture, less than 10%. So whereas nuclear, oil and gas are 30, 40% of all their projects are funded at FID already, so keeping the supply chain busy. All of those green technologies are less than 10% of the world opportunities, not just UK, are actually at FID. So you then have to ask the fundamental question, why is it that the technologies that are seen as the lowest cost and seen as the critical technologies that are most applicable to achieving net zero are actually not getting funded? And it's not just a UK problem, it's a problem all over the world. And I think if we unpick that, Leslie, we can start to get into, so, you know, why is there high cost and why are these low-tech technologies just not affordable anymore?
Well, I think that's very true. I really do. And of course, the thing that I'm always aware of, these are also counted as international trade figures. And, every time a new project starts, people around the world make money out of it. And these are considered to be part of our exports and imports in many different ways and accountable for the economies. But I suppose what I really wanted to try and think about was sort of getting more into the nitty gritty of how these policies impact. So, for instance, of the countries that have integrated strategic policies on trade, on the industrial sector, which of those countries do you think are doing the best in terms of getting that relationship right between the energy and the production?
Yeah, I can give you two examples, I think, of nations, or let's call them localities, that have got a good balance between sort of stakeholder alignment, long-term policy, and just embracing all the opportunities. The Nordics region, and I think people would classically see this, that they are, if you talk about Norway, of course, still an oil and gas producing country. They've got a very smart way of ensuring that some of the profits from that are, reinvested back into their own sovereign fund. They, of course, have Equinor, which is a very interesting company because they've rebranded to get away from their Statoil oil and gas history so that they would be seen as having a green credential. And they do have some relatively high percentage of, the oil companies out there that are investing in green projects, such as offshore wind and hydrogen. Equinor will be involved in those, but they are still vastly, by majority terms, in terms of projects and production and revenues and profits and capex, an oil and gas company. So they've somehow managed to get the balance right between being an oil and gas, but being seen as being a green company as well. One of the stats that's really interesting about Equinor is, if I were to say which oil and gas company anywhere in the world, including Middle East companies and Petrobras and Petronas and others, do you think is developing the most new oil and gas projects in the world right now, you probably wouldn't say Equinor, but it is. They are the most active at developing new oil and gas projects around the world. But so I guess my point is, in the Nordics, they found a way of as a government, as a society, of maximizing the financial outcome from all energy, resources that are in a country. Also, though, developing technology capability, because then you look into Denmark, where, of course, they've incredibly successfully developed a wind industry. And, of course, that's where Ørsted was born, although they sadly now in a lot of financial trouble, not helped by current Trump tactics. But the point is, they aligned their universities, their industry, their policymakers to say we're going to take a long-term 20-year play and put all of our eggs into developing an offshore wind capability and then into that basket, and they've been very successful in that. And two of the three main offshore wind producers or manufacturers outside China or outside Asia right now are still based in Denmark, and how they do it quite incredible. And then the second region I would point to is the Middle East, which is a more up-to-date story, because right now the Middle East and UAE and Saudi, although you would associate them with being oil and gas states, they are trying to differentiate quickly so they're less reliant on oil and gas revenues and less seen as oil and gas, but they're genuinely putting a lot of money into this. And they're not just investing into renewables and hydrogen in a serious way. They're also investing, of course, into tourism and into mining and into many other interesting sectors. And again, if you take both of those regions, they tend to benefit from having long, like 10, 20-year policy decisions. All stakeholders are aligned and all technologies are embraced. And even though they come from a different place, they all basically understand that if you want to have long-term strategic outcomes that lead to trade, that lead to lower costs, that lead to technology innovation, you have to have a 20-year game. You don't have a 4-year game, a 5-year game. And these are some of the key lessons. And of course, it's very hard in the UK for us to take that lesson. We can't do much about it, but we have to respect the fact that we are competing with nations that have that longer term view and are much more collaborative and kind of much more thoughtful in the way they embrace each other's differing views.
I think that's very interesting, because this is really where I was sort of trying to lead us towards this. I started off by saying that, we can no longer operate in the way that we're operating, thinking that we can develop a strategy and do it in isolation all the time doesn't always work. And I was pleased to see that, the industrial strategy is beginning to start looking at the different industries that will need them. And I'm very conscious that you have some information around your Strive and Thrive initiative that, I was very excited by reading some of the details you gave me on that. Perhaps you could spend a little bit of time just thinking about that, because the more we're talking, the more we realise is that actually making energy and industry a political decision isn't always the best thing, as I can see it anyway.
Yes, energy is so much. It's a hot potato, isn't it? I think we've had 5 energy ministers in 5 years in the UK, so that doesn't help. But what I would say is that we, as an energy supply chain company membership organisation, yes, of course, we're very interested in how do our members, how do they deal with these constantly changing headwinds, political headwinds, geopolitical headwinds, financial headwinds, and then COVID and all the other things that have happened to them and all of us. How do they adapt their strategy to deal with that? And, do they make money through those periods? Do some companies actually do better in times of difficulty? Do they take the opportunity when the times are the hardest to innovate the most and come out stronger? And so, yes, we call that research survive and thrive. I've been CEO of EIC for nearly 10 years, and it's kind of one of the first things I was interested in when I came in, which was straight after Brexit. And I was like, oh, here we go. So it's another thing. How are our companies dealing with that? We'd also just had 2 years before, in 2014, a major oil crisis, the last major oil crisis other than the COVID-caused one. And I was interested in, so how are our energy supply chain companies doing? What strategies they're using in this difficult time? And I was out there talking to them, not really thinking it would become an annual research, but just trying to understand, are you okay? What are you using? And I was really inspired by, firstly, the limitless entrepreneurial spirit that is still out there in our industry, in different industries, because these are companies that are not just doing energy, they're doing defense and they're doing infrastructure and they're doing bio and pharma and all sorts of technologies. But the innovation and the entrepreneurial spirit, the resilience that's out there to say, here we go again, it's another challenge, is striking. And so they are not as vulnerable as we would worry to the next challenge and the next energy minister, because they're somehow so accepting of it's just the next challenge and we have to work our way around it. But the second thing I found was that it's very true that it doesn't have to be as difficult as it really is. When you look at companies and they're faced with one challenge and another one and then another one, so many of those challenges that they face are self-imposed, normally by policymakers who are, I'm going to say in the UK, not industry experts normally, so they don't really understand the consequence of a decision they make, which might come from a good place policy-wise, maybe, whether it's the Chancellor, or whether it's the Energy Minister or the Trade Minister, they might have a view which is based on some kind of sensible outcome, but they don't understand the detailed outcomes from a business leader's point of view. And so therefore, what I've learned through the Survive and Thrive research, which I've now interviewed 600 companies over the last 9 years, and we're just about to start the 10th research in the next 2 months, which is, again, asking the question, what strategy do you use to survive and or thrive in challenging energy markets in the UK and around the world? It's always amazing. So in the last 2 years, the most popular strategy that was used was to get as close as possible to the customers that they were already close to, but get closer so that they could develop totally bespoke solutions that were very difficult for others to compete with, normally very tailored solutions that didn't even get to the tender process because they were so bespoke, so sort of tailored right at the C level of the client, that how could anybody else compete with that? It's kind of really interesting strategy. About 40% of companies are doing that now. There isn't any playbook for this. They've just worked it out. And of course, Leslie, as we were talking about in our podcast, frustratingly, for the last 9 years, I've done this research now for 9 years annually, the least used growth strategy every year is the same. And it's developing a new export or international trade market. Companies still feel, and it's 140 companies that I interviewed last year. It was 25 in the first year I did it. So this is a large data set. But if they're going to do anything to grow, the last thing they would do, the hardest thing to do, is to develop a new export market. They would do anything else first.
It's funny, isn't it?
And it's a little bit like an energy
frustrating.
It is so frustrating. And in energy terms, it's a bit like hydrogen. Hydrogen is the same. It's the last thing anyone would do to invest in. They try any other energy strategy before they try hydrogen. So it's that similar sort of, there's always something which is the hardest. And in both terms, it's exporting.
Is it? That is fascinating, isn't it? But nevertheless, we need to grow. We need to think about new markets. And I'm also just going to focus you for just a little while talking about sort of SMEs, because we have this great industrial strategy, and it's all about it's helping 8 different sectors. And I'm really pleased to see the creative industries in there. And there are 2 things that are worrying me about some of the energies that we put towards things. And one of them is that for international trade to operate, we're being told all the time that we have to digitalize. And of course, to digitalize, that means we need more energy. And it feels like a cycle in which industries that may not even think they need that are getting sucked into it. And I wondered if you, how you were working alongside these new digitalizations and how they work with the decarbonisation, and indeed how they work with innovation as well.
I love these questions, Leslie. It's great. It's like the perfect question. So I've got 2 sides to how I'm going to answer this. Firstly is all the research we've done through Survive and Thrive shows that one of the hardest ways to grow actually is digital. And the reason is because you've got a company that isn't digital. They're kind of much more an analog business. They're doing services on site for an oil company or something. And then, we can use digital to help us optimize the way we do our shift patterns, or to be a bit safer, or to, use AI to work out predictive maintenance and so on. It's all good. But unfortunately, what you deal with all the time is a client that's like pretty conservative, pretty risk averse. They're like, well, why would I pay extra for that when you're already on site doing the work anyway, and I trust you? So digital in energy terms, so if you like, in capital intensive industries, is seen as hard to sell, hard to scale, and low margin. It's kind of a tripping off the tongue expression that I use. And right now, AI is interesting. As you look at all the AI technologies that are coming through, the vast majority, I think the stats are 95% of all the initial applications that have been tried have not led to any improvement yet in financially measurable terms. And so that's very early days. It's far too early to write off AI and say it's a bubble and it's all going to collapse. Fear not, investors listening in. But I think AI does suffer a little bit from, the potential seems huge, but someone's got to pay for that extra benefit. And right now, that's not yet clear. Obviously, there are some exceptions, but as the vast majority of the industries out there, they're not yet sure. They know they have to do something and they're exploring it, but how they get paid for that, they're not sure. Now, on the other side of this question, let's now talk about the AI boom, the data center boom, and I'm really interested in this. So, I mean, it's certainly true that we as EIC, we're now tracking data center installations around the world because our members are so interested in it. And there's a whole sector sort of revolution around how do you power data centers, because you need non-intermittent, consistent, typically close to the population, the user population, data center location as well. And so how do you do that? How do you put the data center close to where it is and power it where there's no grid capability? And we are talking here about, I think in the US, it's already a 9% power growth this year compared to last year, complete US, just for data centers. Quite incredible. And this is just arguably the beginning of this sort of revolution. But I link this back to, and this is why your question was good, around how does this all fit in with the decarbonisation agenda? Well, let's sort of repurpose this question to, so you take an Ed Miliband, and he's very, we all know, very keen on decarbonisation. Perhaps we might be wanting him to be more caring about energy security, and therefore this argument around, well, why can't we, why is oil and gas, if you're going to import it, you might as well make it. I don't really care so much about that. I take the view which is, okay, ultimately it's about electrification. If you can electrify, that typically means you're doing it locally. So that means that you are effectively ensuring that you're less vulnerable to importing key fuels and sources of electrification because you're creating it locally. And this is perhaps the answer to, if you can make it locally with locally and sustainable, locally and sustainably provided fuel sources, so let's say wind or solar, or maybe it's some kind of nuclear source, or maybe it's a low-cost gas source, then that arguably is a sort of the way you protect your industry because you've got local jobs. It's the way you take control of your own energy agenda, because it means you then have to think, right, well, what do I have as a nation, which is my own resources that I can use to build my own electrification strategy. And what's really interesting about electrification as a national strategy is it's different for every country. So we have an amazing amount of wind, of course. That we have the largest shoreline in Europe, actually. So we're super lucky in terms of the amount of wind we have if we want to use it. And that's, of course, how our strategy has evolved the way it has. And if you take it as a security strategy rather than a transition strategy, which of course gives us protection against importing, then I sort of completely tick box get the Labour policy, which is, yes, from a security point of view, we should be producing our own power, building a capability in terms of our supply chain that can manage that and integrate it fully, build a grid system that then can handle that. And okay, we're still going to need to have some trade with other countries, but we all know that cables can be cut by, Russian, unfortunately, Russian subsea vessels and drones and submarines and so on. So interconnectors are risky when energy security becomes your priority. So I guess the point I'm making is, if you put energy security as your priority, but not really national security, but just energy security, and then you say, okay, now electrification is the key to that. And then you say, well, what are our natural resources that drive it? So it's nuclear and it's wind. Then our strategy kind of starts to make sense, right? Okay, offshore wind's really important and we're doing that. Onshore wind and solar is good, but there are issues around, do we have the land and are we willing to give up the land? And NIMBYism becomes an issue, which we understand, but we have offshore wind, it's okay. So we don't need to do that all the time. And then gas becomes just a transition fuel, which is what we've always said it should be. And then it's a case of, okay, well, let's make sure we just protect our supply chain, which is currently largely working in the oil and gas environment. So allow them to do that work for the next 20, 30 years, embrace that, because we know it's a dying technology over a 30 to 50 year cycle. We just don't want it to die in 1 to 5 years because our supply chain doesn't have enough work to do in other sectors yet. So I honestly think your question is such a good question because it basically is answering the question, how do you join all the dots here of what is a decarbonisation agenda? And I think you relabel it an energy security agenda, looking at the natural resources and the strengths of our supply chain. You put it all together, and actually the policy work that's underway, and this is a kind of a 20-year policy direction, sort of bipartisan, is correct. So we can get less obsessed with, oh, we're always wrong, or our policy is wrong. Okay, it can be improved, but the direction then is good. And we just need to be a bit smarter on just bringing everybody along with us, making it less picking winners and losers in this interim phase we're in.
So I suppose that sort of really takes me down to, the impact that that digitalization has on everybody. Again, is we've got 99% of our businesses are small to medium-sized businesses. What is that? How can we help these businesses? Because if we want them to be creative, we want them to start manufacturing, we want them to carry on being innovative, what do we do to help them? Because they'll need energy to do this, and they are instantly being burdened with these high prices that, obviously if you're a large user, you can negotiate, but if you're not a large user, where does that leave you?
I think most small businesses are not killed because of energy costs.
Okay.
It is a factor. Oh my word, it would be easier if our costs were half of what they are today. But normally businesses die early on for other reasons more than energy. And perhaps we would all say, I think, that our industrial strategy is not yet good at getting us from startup to scale up. And we know we have so many issues where we have brilliant companies get to sort of, technology readiness level 5, 4, 5, 6. But then it comes to fully functioning pilot and then getting funding to go from first or second customer to 20th, 30th customer is normally where they fail.
Yeah.
And there isn't any funding anywhere available for those companies. And of course, you go into other countries around the world and the funding is absolutely still there. There is, depending upon the country you go to, but in most countries there is funding for that mid-scale scale up phase of a business's life cycle, particularly for certain technologies. We don't seem to have that anywhere. So I think that's one of our issues. And I think the other issue is I have a little dig at our policymakers, which we do tend to have professional politicians, not industry experienced politicians that just have an understanding of one sector or another, and they're put into that political role because of that understanding. And okay, that's the world we're in now, but it's not the same in other countries. In other countries, they are funding their industries better, they're funding their export, investments better, and they're putting in place politicians or at least policymakers and civil servants who have a background in those sectors, and they're leaving them there. They're not moving them here.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I speak as somebody who spoke to 14 different trade ministers in 12 years. It's a mess, and it's difficult to get them to understand the real issues that they are facing. I think that's been superb. Thank you so much for talking about these things. I'm fascinated by how we can move things forward. Fueling the future does seem like a much bigger question than perhaps we are, as you say, within the media is getting recognised. And I do think it's an issue that we need to follow up on. I'd like to sort of throw this open and ask if anyone has any questions. You can either put your hand up or just take yourself off mic, and hopefully we'll be able to pick up who it is, if that's okay. In the meantime, while we're doing that, I'd just like to say I'm very conscious that as we're working through these issues, we do keep siloing these things, and it is a worry for me that we're not being able to sort of do this in a collaborative way. And I suppose one of the things that we feel should be happening is this depoliticizing of industries, depoliticizing of decisions that actually are going to impact beyond one government. And I think we should almost start a movement of beyond one government, because we noticed this a lot when we were working with the trade associations and the trade agreements, that actually one political party made decisions about those trade agreements instead of being a multi-party approach. And most of the time you find across, certainly in Europe, that these people do come up with better solutions. Oh, Lord MP has a question. So,
Stuart, last night we were discussing in Parliament the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, and there was a focus on solar panels and the use of agricultural land good quality agriculture land for solar panels. Now, a whole range of issues came onto the floor which weren't expected. Firstly, something like 68% of the solar panels that we're putting up are Chinese. And there was a lot of members were saying that, in fact, a lot of these panels were being made by slave labor. Lots of things are coming out of left field that you wouldn't have expected. So therefore, why do we not make it a planning requirement that when supermarkets and warehouses are being built, that they're built with the requirement to have the roofs covered in solar panels? For instance, I mean, there's loads, acres and acres and acres of roofs. Now, they may or may not have the structural strength, but you could make it a planning requirement. And, that's an easy win. It doesn't challenge the agricultural land. And in fact, the government are actually not, they're going through their planning and infrastructure bill before they've even published their land use strategy, which is due shortly. I would have thought that's the cart before the horse. But would a simple thing like that not make a difference? Everybody wants to reduce carbon emissions, but in fact, what we're doing is exporting our emissions to Southeast Asia by and large. So why is a simple thing like putting solar panels on warehousing, supermarkets, and incentivizing people with such large roof areas to put arrays on them?
Yeah, great question. Thank you, Lord MP. There's two or three things I'm probably going to give as a response to that. I was one of the companies that went through the Survive and Thrive process was Ponticelli, and they one of the things they've done is put solar panels onto basically new roofs to Disneyland Paris car park. And they're very proud of that project. And that's an example of what you're talking about. And that was actually Disneyland that funded that. So I think you've got businesses that often see more social reasons to do something than government, who feel like they're imposing cost, and they're always faced with the cost argument. As much as anything else, which is you're enforcing costs onto an industry that can't afford it, and then consumers ultimately have to pay. It's an indirect tax. So I think if you really want the absolute lowest cost, then we have to do things like accept Chinese technology. And it's very interesting that in Scotland now, Mingyang, which is the world's largest offshore wind builder, because I was talking about there are 3 large offshore wind manufacturers in the West, but in Asia there are many others, and Mingyang is the largest, and they've just committed to £1.5 billion offshore wind factory in Scotland, which I'm sure is going to cause some debate. But the thing is, offshore wind technology made in Asia or with Asian supply chain is 30% cheaper than made by the European manufacturers. And so if we want to drive down the cost of energy, which is going right back to the first question that Leslie asked us in the UK, we have to be less choosy. We have to be less protectionist. We have to accept that deindustrialization will have to happen before you then reindustrialize in those services and technologies which will work for us in the future, rather than holding on to the technologies of the past. And I think part of this kind of idea of what are we holding on to is also our sense of, NIMBYism is part of that, our sense of, are we happy to give away prime farmland for solar farms? I think it's ultimately all down to, is that the best cost decision to decarbonise? Because if you believe net zero is truly the crisis that many believe in, then we should do what it takes to achieve that goal, and then accept that we've now given away prime farmland and we have to then import. But then you get back to don't we need food security just as much as we need energy security?
Absolutely.
And that debate is complex. And I think, Lord MP, actually the unfortunate outcome of this is you will always have strong voices on both sides of the fence because it is complex. And that's why I think that I was trying to sum up before, perhaps not well enough. Energy security is more powerful as a language than energy transition or net zero. And perhaps food security would then answer the question more clearly around prime farmland. And is that the right thing to do with a solar panel? If we are in a situation where we could be at war in 10 or 20 years' time, how much will then food security matter to us? And then do you put energy security ahead of food security when you're talking about prime farmland? If you can have that relatively narrow structured discussion, which, that acre of land, what's more valuable right now in a food security versus energy security discussion, that perhaps removes some of the hyperbole and you can put some data around that to get a good outcome.
And interestingly, I was just doing some work with BBC Radio Scotland, and they were just announcing that they've announced a free port in the north of Scotland to actually facilitate the building and the importing of the new technologies, the new wind turbines, so they don't have to come into the country first and then leave it again. They don't have to pay the tax on it. They get certain benefits as far as the employment costs are concerned. So it's a concession, and it's a useful experiment to see whether or not they can build a wind turbine centre of excellence in that spot. So
yes, I should say, Leslie, just because it may have sounded like I was saying we're having Chinese turbines built in the UK, and that's meaning we're not having British made. I should say we've never made a wind turbine onshore or offshore in the UK ever.
No.
So actually, it's incredible that we now finally have one manufacturer willing to completely build the turbines in the UK, and either we accept that it's Chinese or not. And the other strange thing about this debate around Chinese technology is, where do you think most of the technology we use all the time is made anyway? And the wind turbine is one of the least cyber dangerous and sort of national security affected technologies. It's most of our oil and gas technology was actually fabricated in China. Most of our marine vessels are fabricated in China. Of course, all of the rare earths come from China. The electric vehicle technology comes from China. The solar panels come from China. So it's a strange, it ended up trapped in a couple of these little technology sort of plays. Just open our eyes and say, hang on, it's too late.
And of course, the other thing that the Paddy Ashdown Forum is very much about is trying to build this bridge across from the east to the west to try and get us to understand that we've actually got to change our approaches to these things. It can't carry on the way it is. I'm not saying that, that we know something that everybody else doesn't know, but we can't carry on this way. We have now got to become a lot more proactive and a lot more engaged in understanding what the Asian countries are capable of and what we can do together. And I think the collaboration is what's missing from everything we've been talking about today.
Can I bring another China story into that, Leslie, very quickly? Another thing about China is, of course, they're a major nuclear technology player. They build way more nuclear power stations than are built in Europe and the US, and the other player is Russia. And China's currently building 16 power stations all at the same time, all the same design, and they will build them in 5 years at, I don't know what, I actually don't know the latest number. I think it's about 30% of the cost of what we build in Europe. So standard technology, built at volume, fast, simple decision making, and we just don't have any of those benefits. So these are all reasons why our costs are so much higher, And we cut ourselves off from the ability to get those benefits. China now are not able to pursue any of the nuclear opportunities in the UK, and perhaps you could argue from a security point of view that one is a better decision. Offshore wind, less so.
It is. It's fascinating. Just, are there any other questions before I start to wind up? Is that yes, there we are. Ian, hello there. Ian?
There we go. Sorry, Tom, public technology. Quick question, Stuart. Offshore wind, of which we've got huge opportunities. Do you see opportunities to make green hydrogen at the times when we don't need the electricity? Do you think that is a technology that is commercially viable and now, or can you see it becoming commercially viable soon, that we could start to when we don't need the electricity and not have to put in batteries, perhaps generate vast amounts of green hydrogen using the seawater, which the turbines are sat in.
Yeah, so it depends on whether you care about the high curtailment costs, which we have, which I think are $1 billion a year right now, and again to increase because our wind production can't be met by the requirements of the grid. So then the grid has to pay back the wind producer because they don't need the wind at that time. And at some point, there will be so much money spent on curtailment if we can't expand the grid, which we should be doing for electrification purposes. Then there probably will be an argument to say we better pay them to do something else. And then the most expensive thing we could pay them to do, of course, is to make green hydrogen. It's a super expensive option rather than paying for curtailment. But then you come down to, are there not other storage solutions to balance our electricity network? And of course, there is a much lower cost storage solution, which is going to battery power. And that, if you look in UK, but also in Germany and the US and others, is if you talk about what's the lowest cost power generation technology, it's solar PV and average around the world. What's the lowest balancing technology? It's battery power. And for long has been very cost affordable battery power, 2 to 4 hour. Now they're going to 4 to 8 hour affordable battery storage to balance power. And this doesn't mean your sort of 2 to 3 week of no wind, no sun that we would get in the winter, summer, of course. But in most economies of the world, that'll be the cost-effective way, far more cost-effective than green hydrogen. So I'm afraid this is one of the data I can give you. So 90% of all the hydrogen projects that have been announced around the world, which is $1.5 trillion worth of projects in hydrogen that have been announced in the last 5 years, all still out there live, supposedly. Only 3% of those are funded. 90% of all of that is green. And only 3% of all of that is funded. So whether it's blue or green or pink, of course, is nuclear powered, so which is something Sizewell C is currently thinking about. It's ultimately just so expensive compared to other ways of getting storage solutions. And I still say, if we go back to Leslie's first question, which is how do we get our cost down, we've got to stop using the higher cost option, like green hydrogen.
Brilliant. Well, I think we're getting to the stage now. If there is just one more question, that'd be lovely. Seeing if anybody is going to put their hand up or stick. Thank you for that question, Ian.
It's a good one.
It is a good one because
you like the answer, Ian?
No, it's a difficult call, isn't it? I know that
the cost point of view. Go ahead, Ian. Yeah.
I work in the shipping industry. Yeah. And we're hard to decarbonise, and all the future fuels use green hydrogen. Yeah. But we are arguing that the cost at the moment is prohibitively expensive. So obviously, had fun and games at the IMO last week.
Absolutely, yeah. You all thought you would go, and now, absolutely, yeah.
So yes, it's a tricky one. But as you say, green hydrogen at the moment is very, very expensive.
Yeah. Thank you, though. Great question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie, for moderating this, giving me all these time.
Yeah, that's great.
Enjoyable.
That's great. Thank you very much indeed. And I think unless anybody else wants to say something quickly, I think we'll say
can I come in? Could I come in?
Of course you can. Of course you can.
Did I understand Ian to say that green hydrogen was the main way for decarbonising the shipping industry? And if green hydrogen's too expensive, well, what else for shipping? The shipping is a major contributor to emissions, surely.
Just sorry, Mike, not to hijack Stuart and Leslie here, but
you're right.
I work for CLNG, so our argument is that methane is at least cleaner than heavy fuel oil and does cut, we would argue, 23% to start us on the journey. Biomethane does it as well, if we can stop the methane slip. But what we're saying is any option, so that for deep sea shipping, you're looking at an energy, again, Stuart commented batteries, and battery technology can take, but energy density is a problem for deep sea shipping. So you're looking at methanol, ammonia or methane as molecules, and to go green with them, all options require green hydrogen, which at the moment, our figures say is 80% of the cost of those fuels is the hydrogen. Once you get that sorted, then the cost will come down. But that's the problem for any option for decarbonising shipping if you're going to use a liquid fuel, which at the moment there's no other alternative, possibly nuclear. And that's where some people are looking at, but potentially others. Anyway, sorry.
And you know what, there's some really fascinating research done because, I don't know whether you realise this, but, you know, and you do, Ian, that the ships will wait and wait outside. So they go at a sort of a normal, an average speed, but they get to the ports early, and then they burn a lot of their fuel just while they're waiting in port to be accepted into the harbour or into the dock. And this is causing, there's a huge amount of research and some serious planning can be done around this to actually mean that almost we have just-in-time delivery as opposed to just-in-time manufacture all the time, so that they're actually planning these deliveries better than they are at the moment. So, instead of burning the fuel just outside ports, they're delivering and then moving on and, keeping the flow going better. And I'm sure you're aware of that, Ian.
Yeah, that's one thing to pick up on, Stuart, with the energy. It does actually work for digitisation. And I think Singapore's leading the way on this point, looking at the technology where it often comes down to commercial arrangements and charter party and how long you're at sea and whether you get the benefit if you get there quicker or not. And that relies on the whole industry working together for the contract of the ship and says we delivered in time, therefore we get the money, as opposed to we took 2 extra days, but we arrived just in time using just enough fuel and not too much fuel.
Yeah, of course.
I agree.
I agree.
Shipping is an industry where digital does work much better. Another example of that, Leslie, is I was talking before about the Russians cutting cables. AI is now being used because, of course, ships, aren't marked as cable cutting ships. But AI is now used for using satellite technology to look at ships that are behaving strangely and going backwards and forwards over the same line. And those are the ones that are targeted to go and pick up for a suspected cable cutting in parts of the world, including around Singapore. So absolutely, shipping is totally different setting, a totally different game when it comes to digital.
Another thing is, of course, is the scale of it that people don't appreciate. If you're powering a container, I was on one of the large cruise ships 2 weeks ago, which was fascinating. But if you've got 6,500 people and 2,500 crew, that is a large town you're powering. And if you come alongside and say, right, we're going to cut off and we're going to take shore power, the implications for the energy, the electricity supply chain, to put a grid in that can power, 3 or 4 big cruise ships. Or alternatively, do you get them, if they're clean, to start putting power into the town or the opposite way?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, absolutely. Very good. I'm aware we've got interesting just at 2:00 when we plan to finish. Thank you all very much indeed for your time. Do let us know if there's anything else you'd like to talk about in more detail. Do come along and talk to us about what your thoughts are on all this. And thank you very much, Stuart, for joining us. A great honour and fascinating conversation. Thank you very much indeed. We'll let you know when the next global conversation is going on, probably before Christmas now. And thanks very much for your time. Appreciate that. Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye.